Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are places in this world that feel untouchable by darkness. Quiet streets where children ride bicycles until the streetlights flicker on. Parking lots where mothers load groceries into their cars without a second thought. School hallways that echo with laughter and slamming lockers. These are the spaces we trust without question, the backdrop of our most ordinary moments. We move through them with the comfortable assumption that nothing terrible could happen here, not in these familiar places, not to us. But safety, as comforting as it feels, is sometimes nothing more than an illusion. It is a story we tell ourselves to make the world manageable, to allow us to function without constant fear. And when that illusion shatters, when the ordinary becomes extraordinary in the worst possible way, we are left scrambling to understand how we missed the signs, how the systems designed to protect us could fail so completely, how someone we passed on the street could harbor such darkness. This is a story about 5 cases that reveal the fragile nature of the safety we take for granted. Each one unfolded in a different way, involved different people, different circumstances. But they share common threads that, when pulled together, reveal uncomfortable truths about the world we inhabit. They speak to the role of technology in both solving crimes and highlighting our vulnerabilities. They expose the cracks in systems we rely on to keep dangerous people contained. They show us how mental illness, youth, impulsivity, and betrayal can converge in moments that change lives forever. These are not stories designed to sensationalize tragedy or exploit pain. They are told with respect for the victims, for the families left behind, for the communities scarred by violence. They are told because understanding how these events unfolded, what warning signs existed, and what failures occurred might help prevent future tragedies. They are told because the people whose lives were cut short deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals who mattered, who had dreams and routines, and people who loved them. The first story begins on an evening that felt like any other. The sky was turning that particular shade of orange that signals the end of a coastal day, the kind of light that makes everything look softer, kinder. In Brookhaven Shores, a town hugging the edge of the Atlantic where everyone knew their neighbors, and crime was something that happened elsewhere, a girl was walking home from an errand. Her name was Lena Hartwell, and she was 11 years old. Lena had been sent to pick up milk and bread from the supermarket 3 blocks from her house. It was a trip she had made dozens of times before, sometimes with her older brother, sometimes alone. Her mother had hesitated that evening, feeling an inexplicable reluctance to let her daughter go by herself. But the store was so close, the neighborhood so safe, and Lena had rolled her eyes at her mother's concern with the particular exasperation that only an 11-year-old can muster. She wanted to be trusted, to be seen as capable and independent. So her mother relented, handed her a $20 bill, and watched from the doorway as Lena disappeared down the sidewalk, her ponytail swinging behind her. The supermarket errand took less than 15 minutes. Security footage from inside the store showed Lena browsing the cereal aisle, picking up a box of her favorite brand, and putting it back when she remembered she was only there for milk and bread. She paid at the register, accepted her change with a shy smile, and left through the automatic doors at exactly 6:43 in the evening. The footage showed a normal child doing a normal task in a normal way. There was nothing in her body language to suggest fear or awareness of danger. What happened next was captured by a camera that no one knew would become crucial. A small business across the street from the supermarket, a shop that sold beach supplies and souvenirs to summer tourists, had installed a basic security system the previous year after a break-in. The camera was positioned to watch the shop's front door, but its angle also captured a portion of the supermarket parking lot and the sidewalk beyond. The owner rarely reviewed the footage unless something went wrong. It ran continuously, recording over itself every week, preserving only the most recent days. On that evening, the camera recorded Lena leaving the supermarket with her grocery bag. It recorded her pausing at the edge of the parking lot, adjusting her grip on the bag. And it recorded what happened when a dark sedan, unremarkable in every way except for what it represented, pulled up alongside her. The footage was grainy, the light fading, but it captured enough. It captured a brief conversation through the car window. It captured Lena shaking her head at first, then nodding. It captured her setting down the grocery bag on the curb. And it captured her getting into the passenger seat. The car drove away at a normal speed, nothing hurried or suspicious. The grocery bag remained on the curb, a detail that would haunt investigators later. Milk and bread, ordinary items on an ordinary evening, left behind like a marker of the moment when ordinary ended. When Lena did not return home by 7:15, her mother called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. By 7:30, her father was driving the route between home and the supermarket, his heart rate climbing with each empty block. By 7:45, they were calling neighbors. By 8 o'clock, they were calling the police. The initial response was measured, almost routine. An 11-year-old girl missing for an hour in a safe neighborhood did not immediately trigger alarm bells. Officers took a description, noted the time frame, suggested she might have stopped at a friend's house without telling her parents. But Lena's mother knew. She knew with the kind of certainty that lives in a parent's gut that something was wrong. She insisted they search immediately, that they take this seriously, that every minute mattered. By 9 o'clock, when Lena still had not been found and none of her friends had seen her, the investigation shifted gears. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. Most people had not. They had been inside making dinner, watching television, living their own ordinary evenings. But one person, the owner of the beach supply shop, mentioned his security camera. He mentioned that it might have captured the sidewalk near the supermarket. When detectives reviewed that footage at 10:30 that night, everything changed. The measured response became frantic. The local investigation became federal. The assumption that Lena had wandered off or made a poor choice was replaced by the horrifying reality that she had been taken. The grainy video was enhanced, frame by frame, in labs designed for exactly this purpose. The car's make and model were identified. Partial license plate numbers were extracted from pixels that barely qualified as images. And the person in the driver's seat, visible for only a few frames, became the most wanted man in the region. His name was released to the public within 18 hours. His face, pulled from the footage and enhanced until it was recognizable, appeared on every news broadcast, every website, every social media platform. Tips began flooding in immediately, hundreds of them, then thousands. People thought they had seen him at gas stations, rest stops, convenience stores. People thought they recognized him from their own neighborhoods, their own towns. The sheer volume of information became overwhelming. A flood that needed to be filtered and prioritized and followed up on while time continued to slip away. Lena's parents appeared on television, pleading for their daughter's safe return. Her father could barely speak, his voice breaking on every word. Her mother held a photograph of Lena, taken just weeks earlier at a school event, and begged whoever had taken her daughter to let her go, to drop her off somewhere safe, to show mercy. The community rallied, organizing search parties and vigils and prayer circles. But beneath the activity was a terrible, growing dread. Everyone knew the statistics. Everyone knew that the first 48 hours were critical, and those hours were rapidly disappearing. Federal agents joined the investigation, bringing resources and expertise that the local police department did not have. They analyzed the footage with advanced software, identifying patterns in the car's movement, tracing its likely route. They interviewed hundreds of people, following leads that stretched across multiple states. And they worked with the grim understanding that they were probably not searching for a living child, but for evidence of what had been done to her. 3 days after Lena disappeared, a hiker in a wooded area 40 miles from Brookhaven Shores noticed something unusual. A piece of clothing caught on a branch, bright pink against the browns and greens of the forest. He investigated further and found more items, scattered as if someone had walked through the woods discarding things as they went. He called the police immediately, his voice shaking as he described what he had found. The search team arrived within the hour, setting up a perimeter and bringing in cadaver dogs and forensic specialists. They worked methodically through the dense woods, marking each piece of evidence with small flags, photographing everything before it was collected. The clothing was identified as Lena's, the same outfit she had been wearing when she left home that evening. And deeper into the woods, in a small clearing hidden from any trail or road, they found her. She had been dead for at least 2 days, the medical examiner would later determine. The cause of death was strangulation, quick and brutal. There were other injuries, evidence of assault, details that would remain sealed in reports to protect what little privacy remained. She had been left there without ceremony or concealment, discarded like something worthless. The investigators, hardened by years of seeing terrible things, found themselves fighting back tears as they processed the scene. Lena's parents were notified before the news became public. They collapsed under the weight of confirmation, the final death of hope. Their daughter, who had only wanted to prove she was responsible enough to walk to the store alone, who had her whole life stretching before her, was gone. The community of Brookhaven Shores went into collective mourning, schools closed for a day, businesses put up memorial signs, strangers embraced on street corners and wept. But even as grief consumed those who knew Lena, the investigation continued. The enhanced footage, combined with tips from the public, led to a suspect in a neighboring state. His name had appeared multiple times in the flood of information, always connected to the same vehicle, the same general description. When officers executed a search warrant on his home, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. Items belonging to Lena were discovered in his basement. His computer contained search histories that revealed planning and intent. And confronted with this evidence, he confessed. His name was Marcus Vance, and he was 34 years old. He had no previous convictions for violent crime, though there were complaints in his past, accusations that had not led to charges, warning signs that had been dismissed or overlooked. He worked as a delivery driver, a job that gave him access to neighborhoods and routes and opportunities. He had been watching Lena, he admitted, for several weeks. He had learned her routine, identified the times she was alone, waited for the right moment. The trial was brief and brutal. Marcus Vance showed no remorse, offering explanations that blamed everyone but himself. He claimed impulse, claimed he had not meant for things to go so far, claimed he panicked. But the evidence told a different story. The search history revealed premeditation. The items in his home revealed collection and planning. The way he had chosen Lena, followed her, convinced her to get in his car with words designed to disarm a child's caution. All of it spoke to intention and control. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some in the community wanted the death penalty, felt that nothing less would serve as adequate punishment. Others, including Lena's parents in a statement that surprised many, said they did not want to prolong the process with years of appeals and uncertainty. They wanted it to be over. They wanted to be able to grieve without the constant reopening of wounds. But Lena's death did not end with the verdict. It rippled outward, changing policies and perspectives in ways both visible and subtle. Brookhaven Shores, which had prided itself on being a place where children could roam freely, where trust was a given, found itself grappling with new realities. Parents became more cautious, more vigilant. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone, even short distances. The innocence that had defined the community was replaced by wariness. On a broader scale, Lena's case became a catalyst for legislative change. Her mother, channeling grief into action, became an advocate for child safety laws. She pushed for expanded surveillance in public areas, for better coordination between law enforcement agencies, for databases that tracked sex offenders and violent criminals more effectively. Some of these initiatives passed, bearing Lena's name, creating requirements that might prevent another child from encountering a predator unseen and unreported. The security camera that captured Lena's abduction became symbolic of a larger debate. Privacy advocates worried about the expansion of surveillance, about the erosion of anonymity in public spaces. But for many parents, for many communities, those concerns felt abstract compared to the concrete reality of what that camera had revealed. It had not saved Lena, but it had solved her case. It had identified her killer when witness accounts alone would have been insufficient. And that distinction, between prevention and solution, between stopping harm before it occurred and providing answers after the fact, became central to discussions about safety in an age of increasing technology. There were difficult questions that lingered long after the trial concluded. How had Marcus Vance moved through society without triggering more serious alarms? What did it mean that he had a history of complaints, but no convictions? Were there systemic failures in how accusations were investigated, how risks were assessed? And perhaps most troubling, how many others like him existed, watching and waiting, their dangers invisible until the moment they acted? Lena's story was not an outlier, not an isolated incident of random evil. It was part of a pattern, a type of crime that occurred with disturbing regularity across the country. Children taken from familiar places by people who understood how to exploit trust and vulnerability. The specific details differed from case to case, but the underlying dynamics remained consistent. Predators who planned and prepared. Victims chosen for their accessibility. Moments of opportunity seized with devastating consequences. And in the aftermath of such crimes, communities were left to grapple with impossible questions. How do you protect children without imprisoning them in fear? How do you maintain the freedom and innocence of childhood while acknowledging the very real dangers that exist? How do you balance vigilance with paranoia, caution with trust? There were no easy answers. Only the ongoing effort to find some middle ground where children could still be children, but where parents did not have to live in constant terror. The technology that captured Lena's abduction continued to evolve. Cameras became more sophisticated, more prevalent, more integrated into the infrastructure of daily life. Facial recognition software emerged, promising to identify suspects in crowds, to track movements across multiple locations, to connect dots that human investigators might miss. These tools solved crimes, prevented some attacks, provided evidence that secured convictions. But they also raised profound questions about privacy, about consent, about the kind of society being created in the name of safety. For Lena's family, none of these broader implications could ease the specific, personal anguish of their loss. Their daughter was gone, and no amount of policy change or technological advancement would bring her back. They established a foundation in her name, funding programs that taught children about personal safety without traumatizing them, that helped parents have difficult conversations about strangers and danger, that supported other families navigating the aftermath of violent crime. It was a way to create meaning from tragedy, to ensure that Lena's life had mattered beyond the manner of her death. In Brookhaven Shores, a memorial was erected in the park where Lena used to play. It was simple and understated, a bench with a plaque bearing her name and dates, surrounded by flowers that community members replaced regularly. Children played nearby, their laughter a reminder that life continued, that innocence persisted even in the shadow of knowledge about what could go wrong. Parents watched from the bench, more attentive than they might have been before, more aware of the preciousness and fragility of the moments they shared with their children. And somewhere in a prison cell, Marcus Vance lived with the consequences of his actions. Reports from the facility suggested he kept to himself, avoided interaction, spent his days in a kind of internal exile. Whether he felt remorse remained unclear and, to many, irrelevant. What mattered was that he would never have the opportunity to hurt another child, that the pattern of his violence had been interrupted, that Lena would be the last name on a list that could have grown much longer. But even as one case reached its conclusion, as justice was served in the limited way that justice can be served when a child is dead, other cases were unfolding across the country. Other predators were watching and planning. Other children were vulnerable in ways their parents could not fully protect them from. And the systems designed to catch these patterns, to intervene before harm occurred, were straining under the weight of limited resources and the sheer volume of potential threats. The second story in this documentary shifts focus from a single, devastating crime to a pattern of violence that unfolded across multiple states and years, a case that revealed not just individual evil, but systemic failure on a scale that seemed almost incomprehensible once the full scope became clear. It began with small offenses that were minimized, dismissed, or lost in bureaucratic confusion. And it ended with a level of destruction that could have been prevented if any one of multiple systems had functioned as it was supposed to. His name was Evan Cross, and his criminal history began when he was barely an adult. The first charges were for theft and assault, minor enough that he received probation rather than prison time. But during that probationary period, there were violations, failures to report to his officer, positive drug tests, associations with known criminals. Each violation should have triggered consequences, revocation of probation, jail time. But the system was overwhelmed, officers carrying caseloads far beyond what was manageable, paperwork lost or delayed, court dates rescheduled and forgotten. Evan Cross slipped through these cracks repeatedly. He learned that rules could be bent or ignored, that punishment was not inevitable, that the consequences authorities threatened rarely materialized. And as his confidence grew, so did the severity of his crimes. The assaults became more violent, the thefts more brazen. He moved from one jurisdiction to another, exploiting the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies, the difficulty of tracking someone who crossed state lines regularly. The pattern of Evan Cross's escalation was visible in retrospect, obvious in the way that terrible things always seem obvious once you know how the story ends. But in real time, fragmented across different police departments and court systems, the pattern was invisible. He was arrested in one state, released on bail, failed to appear for his court date, and by the time a warrant was issued, he was already committing crimes in another state under a slightly different name or with an altered identification. The databases that were supposed to flag such movement were incomplete, outdated, or simply not checked with sufficient frequency. In the Midlands region, a series of home invasions began occurring over a span of 18 months. They followed a similar pattern, targeting houses in rural areas where neighbors were distant and response times slow. The perpetrator seemed to watch his targets carefully, learning their routines, striking when homes were most vulnerable. Items were stolen, but the violence inflicted often seemed disproportionate to the material gain, suggesting that robbery was not the primary motivation. Several victims reported a sense that the intruder enjoyed their fear, that he lingered longer than necessary, that he wanted them to feel powerless. Victims described a man matching Evan Cross's general description, but without solid evidence connecting the crimes. Each was investigated as an isolated incident. Some victims were able to fight back or escape before serious harm occurred. Others were not so fortunate, suffering injuries that would mark them physically and psychologically for the rest of their lives. And because these crimes occurred across different counties, with different investigating officers who did not routinely share information, no one realized they were dealing with a serial offender until the pattern had been repeating for over a year. The Northwest Corridor saw similar incidents, crimes that bore the hallmarks of Evan Cross's methods but were not immediately connected to the Midlands cases. Communication between regions was minimal, hampered by jurisdictional pride, resource limitations, and the simple reality that law enforcement agencies often operated in silos, focused on their own areas of responsibility. It would take a deliberate effort, someone reviewing cases from multiple jurisdictions and recognizing similarities, to connect these dots. And that effort did not happen soon enough. In late autumn, Evan Cross targeted the Bell household in a quiet neighborhood that had never experienced significant crime. The family consisted of 4 people, Robert and Susan Bell, and their 2 children, Mara, who was 14, and Jonah, who was 12. Robert worked as an accountant. Susan taught piano lessons from their home. They were ordinary in every sense, living an unremarkable life that felt safe and predictable. Evan Cross had been watching the family for weeks. He learned when Robert left for work, when Susan's students arrived and departed, when the children came home from school. He identified the home's vulnerabilities, the side door that was not always locked, the alarm system that was frequently forgotten. And on a night in early November, when the family was settling in for a quiet evening, he broke into their home. What happened next was chaos and terror. Robert heard the sound of breaking glass and went to investigate, thinking perhaps a window had cracked in the wind. He found Evan Cross standing in the kitchen, wearing a mask, holding a weapon. Robert's instinct was to protect his family, to create distance between this intruder and the people he loved. He shouted for Susan to call the police, to get the children out of the house. But Evan Cross moved faster than Robert anticipated, and the confrontation turned violent within seconds. Susan heard her husband's shouts and the sounds of a struggle. She grabbed her phone, tried to dial 911, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely press the numbers. She ran toward the noise, saw her husband on the floor, saw the intruder turning toward her. She screamed for the children to run, to get out, to hide. But Mara and Jonah, frozen by fear and confusion, did not immediately respond. They stood at the top of the stairs, watching their world collapse, unable to process what was happening quickly enough to save themselves. Evan Cross overpowered Susan before she could make the call. He moved through the house with a kind of methodical violence, securing the children, neutralizing any possibility of resistance. And then, in actions that still defy any rational understanding, he killed both parents. The violence was excessive, brutal beyond what was necessary to control the situation. It spoke to rage or sadism or some darkness that existed in him independent of any external motivation. Mara and Jonah were tied up, placed in the back of Evan Cross's vehicle, and driven away from the only home they had ever known. Behind them, their parents lay dead, the house silent except for the ticking of a clock in the hallway and the eventual arrival of police responding to a 911 call that had been placed by a neighbor who heard screaming. By the time officers arrived and discovered the bodies, Evan Cross and the children were already miles away. The investigation into the Bell family murders was immediate and intensive. The scene was processed for evidence, yielding DNA and fingerprints that would eventually be matched to Evan Cross once he was in custody. But in those crucial first hours, when Mara and Jonah were still alive and in the custody of their parents' killer, investigators had no clear suspect. They canvassed the neighborhood, reviewed security footage from nearby homes, interviewed anyone who might have seen something unusual. But Evan Cross had been careful, parking his vehicle out of sight, approaching the house from a direction that avoided cameras. The children's abduction was announced publicly within hours, triggering an Amber Alert that spread across multiple states. Their photographs appeared everywhere, accompanied by descriptions of possible vehicles and a plea for information. The community rallied, organizing search parties and distributing flyers, doing everything possible to aid in the search. But without a solid lead, without a clear direction to focus their efforts, the search felt impossibly vast. Mara and Jonah spent 3 weeks in captivity, held in a remote cabin that Evan Cross had been using as a hideout between crimes. The conditions were horrific, the children living in constant fear, unsure whether each day would be their last. Evan Cross was unpredictable, sometimes ignoring them for hours, other times subjecting them to psychological torment that was in some ways worse than physical violence. He told them their parents were dead, described the murders in detail, seemed to enjoy their grief and terror. Mara, as the older sibling, tried to protect her brother, tried to keep him calm and focused on survival. She complied with Evan Cross's demands, did not resist or provoke him, understanding on some instinctive level that their best chance of survival lay in not being perceived as threats. She told Jonah to do the same, to stay quiet, to do whatever was asked of them, to wait for rescue. And she clung to the belief that rescue would come, that someone was looking for them, that they would not die in this terrible place. The break in the case came when Evan Cross made a mistake. He had been meticulous in many ways, but he was also impulsive and prone to arrogance. He needed supplies, cigarettes and food and other items, and he made the decision to leave the children locked in the cabin while he drove to a gas station 20 miles away. At that gas station, a clerk who had been following the news about the missing Bell children noticed something about the man in front of her. The eyes, the general build, something triggered recognition. She could not be certain, but she felt certain enough to note his license plate number and call the police as soon as he left. That tip, combined with traffic camera footage that tracked the vehicle's movements, led investigators to the general area where Evan Cross had been hiding. A coordinated search involving multiple agencies converged on the region, checking every property, every cabin, every possible hiding place. And late one afternoon, officers spotted the vehicle parked behind a structure that matched the description of possible hideouts. They approached cautiously, aware that they might be dealing with a hostage situation, that any mistakes could cost the children their lives. The rescue operation was tense and carefully orchestrated. Officers surrounded the cabin, established communication protocols, prepared for multiple scenarios. When they finally breached the door, they found Mara and Jonah alive but traumatized, filthy and malnourished, their eyes wide with a mix of hope and disbelief. Evan Cross was not present, still on his supply run, a timing coincidence that probably saved lives. The children were extracted quickly, taken to ambulances waiting at a safe distance, surrounded by medical personnel and victim advocates and officers trying to be gentle in their urgency. Evan Cross returned to the cabin an hour later, unaware that his hideout had been discovered. He was arrested without incident, surrounded by officers with weapons drawn, given no opportunity to resist or flee. He seemed almost surprised, as if he had genuinely believed he could continue indefinitely. as if the idea of consequences had never fully penetrated his understanding of the world. The trial for the murders of Robert and Susan Bell was a national sensation, drawing media attention from across the country. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, forensic connections that left no doubt about Evan Cross's guilt. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, claimed childhood trauma and mental illness, but the premeditated nature of the crimes, the careful planning and execution, undermined any suggestion that Evan Cross was not fully aware of and responsible for his actions. Mara and Jonah did not testify, spared that particular trauma through the use of recorded statements and testimony from forensic psychologists who had interviewed them. But their presence was felt throughout the trial, their survival a testament to resilience and luck in equal measure. They were living with relatives now, beginning the long process of healing from horrors that no child should have to endure, no person should have to survive. Evan Cross was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death, a sentence that would be carried out years later after exhausting the appeals process. But before that execution could occur, he died in prison under circumstances that were officially ruled natural causes, but which generated speculation about whether other inmates had delivered their own form of justice. His death was met with little mourning outside his immediate family, and even they struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the monster he had proven himself to be. The aftermath of the Bell case prompted a comprehensive review of the systemic failures that had allowed Evan Cross to continue his pattern of violence for so long. Investigators from multiple agencies came together to trace his movements, to identify every crime he had committed, every opportunity that had existed to stop him before he murdered Robert and Susan Bell. What they found was deeply troubling. Evan Cross should have been in prison long before he ever encountered the Bell family. His parole violations alone were sufficient to revoke his freedom, but those violations had been documented inconsistently, communicated poorly between agencies, and ultimately ignored because the system was too overwhelmed to follow up on every case. His movement across state lines had been enabled by databases that did not communicate with each other effectively, by warrants that were not enforced across jurisdictions, by a fundamental lack of coordination between law enforcement agencies. The review identified at least 7 different points where intervention could have occurred, where Evan Cross's pattern should have been recognized and stopped. Each failure was understandable in isolation, the result of limited resources or bureaucratic confusion or simple human error. But taken together, they represented a systemic breakdown that had cost 2 people their lives and traumatized 2 children beyond measure. Reforms were proposed and, in some cases, implemented. Better databases for tracking offenders across state lines. More funding for parole officers to reduce caseloads. Improved communication protocols between jurisdictions. Mandatory reviews for repeat offenders who violated parole terms. These changes were necessary but insufficient, band-aids on a system that needed fundamental restructuring. And they came too late for the Bell family. Mara and Jonah Bell became symbols, though they never sought that role. Their survival and their resilience inspired others who had experienced similar traumas, providing hope that healing was possible even after unimaginable harm. They spoke publicly only once, years after the trial, at an event advocating for victims' rights. Mara, now a young adult, described the ongoing impact of their experience, the nightmares that persisted, the difficulty trusting people or feeling safe. But she also spoke about strength, about the importance of supporting survivors, about refusing to let what happened define the entirety of their lives. The community that had rallied to search for them during those 3 weeks of captivity continued to support them in quieter ways afterward. Scholarship funds were established. Therapy was provided. Neighbors checked in regularly, offering help without being intrusive. It was an example of collective compassion, of a community refusing to move on and forget even as the media attention faded and other stories dominated headlines. For investigators who had worked the case, the Bell murders and the capture of Evan Cross represented both success and failure. Success in that they had solved the crime, rescued the children, secured a conviction. Failure in that the crime should never have happened, that the warning signs had been there, that the system had let the Bell family down in fundamental ways. Some of those investigators left law enforcement afterward, burned out by the accumulation of tragedies, by the knowledge of how many cases like this existed, by the frustration of working within systems that seemed designed to fail. But others remained, carrying the lessons of the Bell case forward, determined to improve those systems, to advocate for changes that might prevent the next Evan Cross from slipping through the cracks. They became experts in serial offender patterns, in risk assessment, in the importance of cross-jurisdictional communication. They trained new officers, shared what they had learned, tried to ensure that future investigations would benefit from hard-won knowledge. The third case in this documentary shifts tone and scale. Where the first two involved adult predators and systems that failed to stop them, this case involves young people making terrible decisions in moments of fear and immaturity, decisions that could not be undone, that destroyed multiple lives in ways that complicated any simple narrative about good and evil, victim and perpetrator. Redstone Valley was a small town built along the curves of a river that gave the area its name. The valley itself was beautiful, surrounded by hills that turned brilliant colors in autumn, home to families who valued the quiet pace of life away from cities. It was the kind of place where teenagers felt both trapped by the lack of options and safe in the familiarity of everyone knowing everyone else. Emily Rowe was 15 years old, a sophomore in high school who was still figuring out who she was and who she wanted to be. She had been adopted as a baby by a couple who loved her deeply, but who struggled with their own issues, financial stress, and occasional conflict that made home feel unstable at times. Emily was sensitive to this instability, internalizing her parents' stress, trying to be easy and undemanding even when she needed support. She met Caleb Turner during freshman year, and the connection between them was immediate and intense in the way that teenage relationships often are. Caleb was 14, a year younger than Emily, quiet and artistic, someone who seemed to understand her in ways that others did not. They became inseparable, spending every possible moment together, texting constantly when they were apart, building a relationship that felt all-consuming and essential. But that intensity also created pressure. They were too young to understand how to manage the emotional weight of their attachment, how to maintain boundaries or perspective. Every disagreement felt catastrophic. Every moment apart felt unbearable. And when Emily discovered she might be pregnant, the fear and panic threatened to overwhelm them both completely. The pregnancy scare was ultimately false, a missed period caused by stress rather than conception. But before they knew that, before Emily took a test that would provide clarity, they spent days in a state of escalating terror. They could not tell their parents, could not imagine the disappointment and anger that would follow. They could not imagine raising a child when they were barely more than children themselves. And they could not imagine the shame and judgment from their community, from classmates and teachers and neighbors who would see them differently forever. Caleb's response to this fear was to retreat, to become distant and uncommunicative, leaving Emily feeling abandoned at the moment when she needed him most. She interpreted his withdrawal as rejection, as evidence that he did not care about her, that she was facing this crisis alone. The reality was that Caleb was drowning in his own panic, unable to process the situation, desperately wishing it would simply disappear. But he was too immature to communicate this, too overwhelmed to offer the support Emily needed. They agreed to meet at a location they had visited many times before, a spot along the river where the bank formed a small beach, hidden from view by trees and accessible only by a path that most people did not know about. It was their place, somewhere they went to escape the pressures of school and family, somewhere they felt they could be themselves without judgment. On that particular evening in late spring, with the sun setting and the river flowing quietly past, they met to talk about what they were going to do. The conversation started calmly enough, both of them trying to be mature, trying to figure out a solution. But the fear kept surfacing, distorting their words, making everything feel more desperate than it was. Emily wanted reassurance that Caleb would stay with her, that they would face this together. Caleb wanted to believe that maybe it was all a false alarm, that maybe they were panicking over nothing. Their inability to understand each other, to bridge the gap between their different ways of processing fear, caused the conversation to escalate. Emily accused Caleb of not caring, of wanting to abandon her. Caleb denied this, but his denials came across as defensive rather than comforting. Emily started crying, her emotions overwhelming her ability to communicate clearly. Caleb felt attacked and cornered, his own fear turning into frustration. The argument spiraled, words becoming harsher, accusations more pointed. And then Emily said something, some threat or ultimatum, something about telling everyone, about making sure Caleb faced consequences too. What happened next was a tragedy born of impulse and immaturity rather than calculated violence. Caleb, overwhelmed by panic and anger, pushed Emily. It was not a gentle push, not a simple gesture of frustration. It was hard enough to make her stumble backward, to lose her footing on the sloped riverbank. She fell, hit her head on a rock partially submerged in the shallow water, and went still. Caleb stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. He called her name, waited for her to move, to sit up and yell at him. But she did not move. He approached slowly, touched her shoulder, tried to shake her awake. And then he saw the blood in the water, the way her head was positioned at an unnatural angle, the complete absence of breath or response. He had killed her, not intentionally, not with planning or premeditation, but the outcome was the same. Emily was dead, and he was responsible. The panic that followed was complete and irrational. Caleb did not call for help, did not attempt CPR, did not do any of the things that might have given Emily a chance if she was not already beyond saving. Instead, he ran. He left her body in the river, grabbed her phone and backpack to hide evidence of their meeting, and fled back to town. He went home, went to his room, and tried to pretend that nothing had happened, that the evening had been ordinary, that Emily was fine somewhere else. When Emily did not come home that night, her parents called the police. They called Caleb's house, asking if he knew where she was. Caleb lied, said he had not seen her, had no idea where she might be. The guilt was immediate and crushing, but he was too frightened to admit what he had done, too terrified of the consequences to take responsibility. The search for Emily Rowe began at dawn, with volunteers spreading out across Redstone Valley, checking places she was known to frequent. Her parents were frantic, barely able to function as hours passed without any sign of their daughter. Friends joined the search, classmates who remembered seeing Emily at school that day, who could not understand where she could have gone. The town mobilized, everyone contributing in whatever way they could, united by the hope that Emily would be found safe. Caleb joined the search, partly to avoid suspicion, partly out of some confused sense that he needed to be there, to witness the consequences of what he had done. He walked through the woods with a group of classmates, called Emily's name along with everyone else, maintained the pretense that he was just another worried friend hoping for her safe return. But inside, he was fracturing, the weight of his secret becoming unbearable with each passing hour. It took 2 days for someone to find Emily's body. A search and rescue volunteer noticed something in the river, a flash of color that did not belong. He waded into the water and discovered Emily, her body caught against a fallen log, partially submerged. He shouted for help, his voice breaking, and within minutes the search transformed from rescue to recovery. Emily's parents were notified, and their grief echoed through the entire community. The girl who had been missing was now confirmed dead, and the nature of her death suggested violence or accident, something that required investigation rather than simple mourning. The autopsy revealed the head injury, the trauma that had killed her. The medical examiner determined that she had died where she was found, that she had not been moved post-mortem. The investigation focused on the riverbank, on the possibility of an accident, on who might have been with her when she fell. And attention quickly turned to Caleb Turner, the boyfriend who had claimed not to have seen Emily on the day she disappeared, but whose story began to unravel under scrutiny. Phone records showed text messages between Emily and Caleb arranging to meet at the river. Classmates reported that the two had seemed tense lately, that they had been arguing. And when detectives interviewed Caleb again, this time with more specific questions, his lies became obvious. He contradicted himself, could not remember details he should have known, showed signs of stress that went beyond normal grief. And finally, confronted with evidence that placed him at the river with Emily, he broke down and confessed. The confession was a flood of words, everything spilling out in a chaotic rush. He described the pregnancy scare, the argument, the push, the panic. He insisted he had not meant to hurt her, that it had been an accident, that he loved her and would never have wanted her to die. He cried as he spoke, his remorse genuine but ultimately insufficient to change what had happened. Emily was dead, and his actions, however unintentional the final outcome, had caused her death. The decision to charge Caleb as an adult was controversial and painful. He was 14 years old, barely into high school, a child by most definitions. But the severity of the crime, the fact that he had pushed Emily and then fled rather than seeking help, the days he had spent lying while her family searched desperately, all of these factors argued for adult prosecution. The district attorney believed that anything less would fail to acknowledge the gravity of what had occurred, would send a message that young people could escape serious consequences for terrible actions. The trial was heartbreaking for everyone involved. Emily's parents sat in the courtroom every day, watching the boy their daughter had loved being held accountable for her death. Caleb's parents sat on the opposite side, their own grief mixed with horror at what their son had done, their love for him complicated by the knowledge that his actions had destroyed another family. And Caleb himself, now facing the adult justice system, seemed to shrink under the weight of the proceedings, a child in a courtroom designed for adults, facing consequences that would define the rest of his life. The prosecution argued that Caleb's actions after Emily's death demonstrated consciousness of guilt, that his lies and cover-up attempts showed he understood the wrongness of what he had done. They presented evidence of the argument, of the force with which he had pushed her, arguing that this was not a simple accident but a violent act that resulted in death. They asked the jury to hold Caleb accountable not as a child who made a mistake, but as someone who had taken a life and then tried to hide that fact. The defense painted a different picture, one of two scared teenagers overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their maturity to handle. They emphasized Caleb's age, his lack of criminal history, his immediate remorse once he was caught. They argued that charging him as an adult was cruel and excessive, that it ignored developmental science about adolescent brain development and impulse control. They asked the jury to see Caleb as someone who deserved rehabilitation rather than punishment, who could potentially learn from this tragedy and eventually contribute positively to society. The jury deliberated for 3 days, struggling with the impossible task of weighing justice for Emily against mercy for Caleb. In the end, they returned a verdict of guilty on manslaughter charges, a compromise that acknowledged both the seriousness of the crime and the mitigating factors of Caleb's age and lack of intent to kill. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a juvenile facility, with the possibility of additional adult prison time depending on his behavior and progress in rehabilitation programs. The sentence satisfied no one completely. Emily's parents felt it was too lenient, that 15 years could not compensate for the lifetime their daughter would never have. Caleb's parents felt it was too harsh, that their son was being punished as an adult for actions he committed as a frightened child. And the community remained divided, some sympathizing with Caleb's youth and the tragedy of 2 young lives destroyed, others feeling that sympathy for the perpetrator dishonored Emily's memory. Caleb served his sentence in a facility designed for young offenders, participating in therapy and educational programs, slowly coming to terms with what he had done and what it meant. Reports suggested that he was genuinely remorseful, that he understood the magnitude of his actions in ways he could not have at 14. But that understanding came too late to change anything, too late to bring Emily back or to heal the wounds his actions had caused. Emily Rose's death sparked conversations in Redstone Valley and beyond about teen relationships, about the pressures young people faced, about the importance of providing support and guidance rather than judgment. Schools implemented programs teaching healthy relationship dynamics, providing resources for students dealing with pregnancy scares or other crises. Parents were encouraged to maintain open communication with their children, to create environments where teenagers felt they could ask for help without fear of condemnation. But these preventive measures, while valuable, could not address the fundamental tragedy at the heart of Emily's story. She had been a girl trying to navigate the complexities of adolescence, trying to manage emotions and relationships she was not yet equipped to handle. And in a moment of fear and anger, she had died, not because she deserved harm, not because she made terrible choices, but because the person she trusted most had lost control in a way that could not be undone. The 4th case in this documentary returns to adult perpetrators but introduces the complicating factor of mental illness, forcing difficult questions about responsibility, justice, and the purpose of the legal system when dealing with someone whose actions may have been influenced by psychological conditions beyond their control. Clearwater Ridge was a prosperous suburb, The kind of place where success was measured in degrees earned and positions held, where families competed politely over whose children achieved more. Margaret Hale fit perfectly into this environment. She was 50 years old, a beloved high school English teacher known for her passion for literature and her dedication to her students. Her colleagues respected her, her students adored her, parents trusted her with their children's education and growth. Margaret's personal life seemed equally successful. She was a single mother, having divorced her husband years earlier, but she had raised her son Lucas with devotion and care. Lucas was 17, a senior in high school, academically gifted, athletic, seemingly destined for a bright future. He had been accepted to several prestigious universities and was planning to study engineering. From the outside, the Hale household was a model of single-parent success, proof that hard work and love could overcome any obstacle. But beneath this polished exterior, both Margaret and Lucas were struggling in ways that remained invisible to their community. Margaret dealt with anxiety that she managed through medication and therapy, carefully maintaining her composure in public while privately battling constant worry. Lucas faced pressures that he could not articulate, expectations that felt crushing, a sense that he was performing a role rather than living authentically. And increasingly, he was experiencing symptoms that he did not understand and did not share with anyone. The symptoms began subtly, intrusive thoughts that Lucas could dismiss as stress or imagination. But they escalated, becoming more persistent and disturbing. He began hearing voices, whispers that seemed to come from just outside his perception, commenting on his actions, making suggestions. He experienced paranoia, feeling that people were watching him, judging him, plotting against him. And he struggled with dissociation, moments where reality felt distant and unreal, where his own actions seemed to be happening to someone else. Lucas did not tell his mother about these experiences. He was terrified of being seen as weak or damaged, of losing his university acceptances, of disappointing the mother who had sacrificed so much for him. He tried to manage the symptoms on his own, avoiding triggers, staying busy, convincing himself that he could push through until graduation and college, that the problem would resolve itself once he escaped the pressures of high school and home. As the holidays approached, Lucas's symptoms intensified. The voices became more insistent, more aggressive. They told him that people were planning to hurt him, that his mother was part of a conspiracy against him, that he needed to protect himself. He knew, on some rational level, that these thoughts were not real, that the voices were symptoms of something wrong in his brain. But the illness was stronger than his rational mind, distorting his perception until he could no longer distinguish between reality and delusion. On the evening of December 23rd, Margaret was preparing for a quiet Christmas celebration, wrapping gifts and planning meals. Lucas was in his room, ostensibly studying for final exams, but actually spiraling deeper into psychosis. The voices were screaming now, filling his head with commands and threats. They told him that his mother was going to poison him, that she was working with others to destroy him, that he had to act first to save himself. What happened next was sudden and incomprehensible. Lucas walked downstairs, found his mother in the kitchen, and attacked her with a violence that seemed to come from nowhere. Margaret had no warning, no time to defend herself or understand what was happening. Her son, whom she loved and trusted, whom she had raised and supported, was killing her. The attack was brutal and prolonged, fueled by delusions that made Lucas believe he was fighting for his survival rather than murdering his mother. When it was over, when Margaret lay dead on the kitchen floor, Lucas experienced a moment of clarity that was devastating in its completeness. The voices were suddenly quiet. The paranoia evaporated, and he was left standing over his mother's body, holding a weapon, knowing with terrible certainty what he had done. He called 911 himself, his voice flat and emotionless, reporting that he had killed his mother and needed police to come to the house. Officers arrived to find Lucas sitting calmly in the living room, covered in blood, waiting for them. He did not resist arrest, did not try to flee. He confessed immediately, describing what he had done with disturbing precision but showing little emotional reaction. It was as if the act of committing the crime had temporarily disconnected him from his emotions, leaving him capable of functioning but unable to feel anything about what had occurred. The investigation revealed no clear motive in the traditional sense. Lucas had not been angry with his mother, had not been planning her murder, had no rational reason to want her dead. His room was searched, his computer and phone examined, but there was no evidence of planning or premeditation. What emerged instead was a picture of a young man suffering from undiagnosed and untreated mental illness, a psychotic break that had turned him into someone unrecognizable even to himself. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted, multiple experts examining Lucas and reviewing his history. The diagnosis was schizophrenia, a severe mental illness that typically emerges in late adolescence or early adulthood. The symptoms Lucas had been experiencing, the voices and paranoia and delusions, were classic manifestations of this condition. And the violence against his mother, while shocking and tragic, fit a pattern seen in cases where schizophrenia goes untreated and the sufferer becomes trapped in delusional beliefs about threats from loved ones. The question facing the legal system was how to respond to this situation. Lucas had killed his mother, a fact that was not in dispute, but he had done so while experiencing a severe psychiatric episode, while his perception of reality was completely distorted by illness. Was he criminally responsible for actions taken during psychosis? Could he be held accountable in the same way as someone who committed murder with full awareness and intent? The decision to pursue an insanity defense was controversial from the start. Many people in Clearwater Ridge were horrified by the idea that Lucas might avoid prison, that he might be treated in a hospital rather than punished in a correctional facility. Margaret had been beloved, her death a shock to the entire community, and there was a strong sentiment that her son should face the harshest possible consequences regardless of his mental state. But the legal standard for insanity is specific and difficult to meet. The defense had to prove that Lucas, at the moment he killed his mother, was unable to understand that what he was doing was wrong due to mental illness. The prosecution argued that Lucas's ability to call 911 afterward, to describe his actions coherently, demonstrated that he retained some capacity to understand right from wrong. The defense countered that the clarity came after the psychotic episode had passed, that during the actual attack Lucas had been completely controlled by delusional beliefs. The trial was a painful examination of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the purpose of justice. Expert witnesses testified about schizophrenia, about how it affects perception and judgment, about the difficulty of recognizing symptoms in high-functioning individuals who are skilled at hiding their struggles. Teachers and coaches testified about Lucas's character before the illness manifested, painting a picture of a kind and responsible young man who would never have harmed anyone without the distorting influence of psychosis. Margaret's colleagues and friends testified about their loss, about the woman who had been taken from them, about the impossibility of accepting that her own son had killed her. Some expressed sympathy for Lucas, recognizing that he too was a victim of his illness even as he was the perpetrator of violence. Others felt that sympathy for Lucas betrayed Margaret's memory, that focusing on his mental illness diminished the horror of what he had done. The jury struggled with the decision, deliberating for nearly a week before reaching a verdict. They found Lucas not guilty by reason of insanity, a decision that meant he would be committed to a psychiatric facility rather than sent to prison. The verdict sparked immediate and intense reaction. Some saw it as a just recognition that Lucas was not fully responsible for actions taken during psychosis, that punishment would serve no purpose when treatment was what was needed. Others saw it as a failure of justice, a system prioritizing the perpetrator over the victim. Lucas was committed to a secure psychiatric facility where he would receive long-term treatment for his schizophrenia. The commitment was indefinite, dependent on his progress and his ability to be stabilized on medication. He would remain in custody, unable to leave or live independently, potentially for the rest of his life. It was not freedom, not an escape from consequences, but it was treatment rather than punishment, a recognition that his illness required medical intervention rather than incarceration. The community remained divided long after the trial concluded. Support groups formed for both sides, some advocating for better mental health awareness and early intervention, others feeling that the insanity verdict had set a dangerous precedent. Margaret's family struggled with complicated grief, mourning a woman they loved while trying to reconcile that her killer was her own son, someone they had also loved, someone who was now confined to a psychiatric facility for an indefinite period. The case prompted discussions about mental health screening in schools, about the warning signs of conditions like schizophrenia, about the importance of reducing stigma so that young people feel comfortable seeking help when they experience troubling symptoms. Some schools implemented programs training teachers and counselors to recognize potential mental health crises. Resources were made available for families dealing with severe mental illness in adolescents and young adults. But these preventive measures, while valuable, could not change what had happened to Margaret Hale. She was gone, her life cut short by violence that emerged from illness rather than malice. Her legacy became complicated, remembered not just for her contributions as a teacher, but also as a victim of a tragedy that highlighted the devastating consequences when mental illness goes unrecognized and untreated. Lucas remained in the psychiatric facility, his future uncertain. Reports suggested that medication had stabilized his symptoms, that he was no longer experiencing the voices and delusions that had driven him to violence. But with that stability came full awareness of what he had done, of the fact that he had killed his mother, and the psychological burden of that knowledge was immense. He participated in therapy, worked with his treatment team, but he would never be the person he had been before the illness manifested, never reclaim the life he had been building before schizophrenia destroyed everything. The questions raised by Lucas's case had no easy answers. How do we balance compassion for those suffering from severe mental illness with justice for victims? At what point does mental illness absolve someone of responsibility for their actions? What does punishment mean when the perpetrator's capacity for rational thought was compromised? And how do we create systems that identify and treat mental illness before it leads to tragedy? These questions extended beyond Lucas Hale's individual case, touching on broader debates about the intersection of mental health and criminal justice. The legal system, designed to address intentional wrongdoing, often struggled when confronted with cases where intent was complicated by psychiatric conditions. The result was inconsistency, cases that seemed similar producing vastly different outcomes depending on jurisdiction, jury composition, and the quality of expert testimony. For families navigating the aftermath of violence connected to mental illness, the challenges were immense. They grieved for victims while also, in some cases, feeling sympathy for perpetrators whose actions stemmed from illness rather than choice. They faced judgment from communities that did not understand the complexities involved, that saw any sympathy for the mentally ill perpetrator as betrayal of the victim. And they dealt with the practical realities of a system that offered limited support for either treatment or prevention. Margaret Hale's story became a case study in these complexities, a tragedy that resisted simple narratives about good and evil, victim and perpetrator. She was remembered at Clearwater Ridge High School with a scholarship in her name, funding students pursuing degrees in education. Her colleagues organized an annual reading event celebrating the literature she had loved and shared with generations of students. And her loss remained a wound in the community, a reminder of how quickly and completely life can be destroyed by forces that seem to come from nowhere. The fifth and final case in this documentary returns to the theme of trust and betrayal, examining how violence can emerge from relationships that are supposed to be based on care and professional responsibility. It is a reminder that danger does not always come from strangers, that sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones who pose the greatest threat. Northbridge City was a mid-sized urban area, diverse and busy, where people moved through their days with the practical focus that city living demands. Rachel Moore was 57 years old, a woman who had built a quiet and meaningful life around helping others. She worked as a caregiver, employed by a home health agency that provided services to elderly and disabled clients who needed assistance with daily living tasks. Rachel was known for her patience and kindness, her ability to make clients feel comfortable and respected, her dedication to providing not just physical care, but also emotional support. Rachel's routine was predictable and carefully structured around her clients' needs. She visited multiple homes each day, following a schedule that rarely varied. She helped with bathing and dressing, prepared meals, managed medications, provided companionship to people who were often isolated and lonely. It was demanding work, both physically and emotionally, but Rachel found it rewarding. She formed genuine connections with her clients, learning their histories and preferences, making them feel seen and valued in a system that often treated elderly care as a transactional service. One of Rachel's regular clients was an elderly woman named Dorothy, who lived in a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Dorothy had mobility issues and needed assistance several times a week. Rachel had been visiting her for nearly 2 years, and they had developed a warm relationship. Dorothy looked forward to Rachel's visits not just for the practical help, but for the conversation and connection. Rachel, in turn, was protective of Dorothy, advocating for her needs with the home health agency and checking on her even on days when she was not officially scheduled to work. But Dorothy's apartment building was also home to Daniel Frost, a man in his mid-40s who lived alone and was on parole for previous violent offenses. Daniel had been released from prison 2 years earlier after serving time for aggravated assault. As part of his parole conditions, he was required to meet regularly with a parole officer, maintain employment, and avoid any contact with potential victims. But the supervision was minimal. The parole system stretched too thin to provide the level of oversight that someone with Daniel's history required. Daniel noticed Rachel during her visits to Dorothy's apartment. He learned her schedule, recognized the pattern of her comings and goings, and he began to fixate on her, developing an obsession that grew more intense as time passed. He convinced himself that he knew her, that they had a connection, that she would be receptive to his attention if he could find the right way to approach her. It was a delusion, a distortion of reality that ignored the fact that Rachel had never spoken to him, had no idea who he was, had given no indication of interest. On a Tuesday morning in late February, Rachel followed her usual routine. She visited 2 clients in the early morning, grabbed coffee from a shop she frequented, and headed to Dorothy's apartment for a mid-morning visit. She parked on the street, gathered her supplies from the back seat, and walked toward the building entrance. Daniel Frost was waiting, watching from a location that gave him a clear view of her arrival. And when Rachel entered the building, Daniel followed her. What happened in the stairwell between the ground floor and Dorothy's apartment remains partially unclear, reconstructed from evidence and Daniel's later confession. He approached Rachel, tried to start a conversation, said things that made her uncomfortable. Rachel, experienced in de-escalating difficult situations, tried to be polite but firm, making it clear she was not interested in talking. But Daniel was not deterred. He blocked her path, became more insistent, and when Rachel tried to move past him, he grabbed her. The struggle was brief and one-sided. Rachel fought back, tried to call for help, but Daniel was stronger and more violent. He overpowered her quickly, dragged her to a location within the building where they would not be easily discovered, and killed her. The violence was excessive, motivated by rage that seemed disproportionate to anything Rachel had said or done. It appeared that Daniel's fantasy of connection had been shattered by Rachel's rejection, and the resulting fury had driven him to murder. Rachel's body was discovered hours later by another caregiver who had come to check on Dorothy when Rachel failed to arrive for her scheduled visit. The caregiver found the stairwell door slightly ajar, investigated, and saw Rachel lying motionless. She called 911, her voice shaking, describing what she had found but unable to fully process the horror of it. The investigation moved quickly. Security cameras in the building provided footage of Daniel following Rachel, though the actual attack occurred in a location without camera coverage. Witnesses reported seeing Daniel in the area around the time Rachel went missing. And when police approached him for questioning, his behavior was suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. A search of his apartment revealed items belonging to Rachel, taken from her car or person after the murder. And when confronted with this evidence, Daniel confessed. His confession was disturbing in its lack of genuine remorse. Daniel acknowledged killing Rachel but framed it as her fault, claiming she had led him on, that she should have been nicer to him, that she had provoked his anger by rejecting him. He seemed unable or unwilling to take full responsibility for his actions, to understand that Rachel had done nothing wrong, that his obsession and violence were entirely his own responsibility. It was a pattern common in such cases, perpetrators blaming victims for their own violent responses, refusing to accept accountability. The revelation that Daniel Frost had been on parole at the time of the murder sparked immediate outrage. How had someone with his history been living unsupervised in a building where vulnerable people resided? Why had his parole officer not recognized the risk he posed? What failures in the system had allowed him to move freely enough to target and kill an innocent woman? The investigation into the parole system's handling of Daniel's case revealed troubling patterns. His parole officer had a caseload far exceeding recommended limits, making thorough supervision impossible. Daniel had missed several required check-ins, but those violations had not been reported or acted upon promptly. He had been unemployed for months, another violation of his parole conditions, but again, the failure to maintain employment had not triggered immediate consequences. The system, overwhelmed and under-resourced, had essentially allowed Daniel to operate without meaningful oversight. Rachel's family was devastated, not just by her death, but by the knowledge that it could have been prevented. If Daniel had been properly supervised, if his violations had been taken seriously, if the system had functioned as it was supposed to, Rachel would still be alive. Their grief was compounded by anger, by a sense that Rachel had been failed by institutions designed to protect public safety. The trial was straightforward in terms of evidence, but complicated by Daniel's attempts to shift blame. The prosecution presented overwhelming proof of his guilt, including forensic evidence, security footage, and his own confession. They portrayed him as a violent predator who had targeted a vulnerable woman, who had killed her when she refused his advances, who showed no genuine remorse for his actions. They asked the jury to hold him fully accountable, to ensure he would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. The defense attempted to argue that Daniel's mental health issues and difficult background should be considered as mitigating factors. They painted a picture of a man damaged by his own experiences, someone who had not received adequate treatment or support. But these arguments gained little traction. Whatever sympathy might have existed for Daniel's circumstances was overshadowed by the brutality of what he had done to Rachel, by his victim-blaming attitude, by the preventable nature of the crime. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Daniel to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured he would die behind bars. As the sentence was read, Daniel showed no visible reaction, maintaining the same emotionless demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. Rachel's family wept, some in relief that justice had been served, others in continued grief that no sentence could bring Rachel back. In the aftermath of Rachel's murder, her family established a scholarship fund in her name, supporting students pursuing careers in caregiving professions. They wanted to honor Rachel's dedication to helping others, to ensure that her legacy was defined by the love and care she had provided rather than the violence that ended her life. The scholarship became a way for Rachel's values and compassion to continue impacting lives, creating good from tragedy. The home health agency that employed Rachel implemented new safety protocols, providing training on recognizing potential threats, establishing buddy systems for caregivers working in potentially dangerous situations, creating better communication systems for reporting concerns. These changes were necessary but painful acknowledgments that the work Rachel had loved carried risks that had not been adequately addressed. The parole system underwent review and reform in the wake of Rachel's murder. Caseload limits were imposed, requiring that parole officers not exceed a certain number of supervises. Technology was implemented to better track violations and ensure timely responses. Training was enhanced to help parole officers identify high-risk individuals who required more intensive supervision. These changes were steps in the right direction, though critics argued they came too late and did not go far enough to address systemic problems. For Daniel Frost's previous victims, those who had survived his earlier acts of violence, Rachel's murder was a devastating confirmation of fears they had lived with since his release. They had worried that he would hurt someone else, that parole would not be sufficient to contain his violent impulses, that the system would fail another victim the way it had failed to protect them initially. Their fears had been proven correct, and the knowledge that they had been right brought no comfort, only additional trauma. The intersection of Rachel's story with the broader issue of parole oversight highlighted uncomfortable truths about how society manages individuals who have demonstrated violent tendencies. The ideal of rehabilitation, of people paying their debt to society and earning a second chance, clashed with the reality that some individuals remain dangerous, that release from prison does not eliminate the risk they pose. And the systems designed to balance these competing concerns, to provide supervision while respecting rights, often proved inadequate when tested by challenging cases. Rachel Moore's death was preventable in multiple ways. if Daniel Frost had received genuine rehabilitation during his initial incarceration, if his parole supervision had been adequate, if building security had been better, if Rachel had been warned about the risk posed by a resident in the building she visited regularly. Each of these failures, while understandable in isolation, combined to create circumstances where Rachel's murder became almost inevitable. The community where Rachel had worked mourned her loss deeply. Her clients, many of whom relied on her not just for physical assistance, but for emotional support and companionship, struggled with the absence of someone who had made their lives better. Memorial services were held, attended by hundreds of people whose lives Rachel had touched through her work and her kindness. Stories were shared about her patience, her humor, her ability to make people feel valued and cared for. And there was collective acknowledgement that the world had lost someone who had made it demonstrably better through her presence. For Dorothy, the elderly woman Rachel had been on her way to visit when she was killed, the loss was particularly acute. She had considered Rachel a friend, someone she looked forward to seeing, someone who treated her with respect and dignity in a phase of life where many people felt invisible. Learning that Rachel had died in her building, while on her way to provide care, added a layer of guilt to Dorothy's grief. She knew, rationally, that she bore no responsibility for what had happened. But emotions are not rational, and Dorothy struggled with the feeling that Rachel had been in danger because of her, because of the care Dorothy needed and Rachel had been providing. The other caregivers in Rachel's agency, her colleagues who did similar work, were shaken by her murder. They had always known, on some level, that their work carried risks. They entered strangers' homes, dealt with people in vulnerable and sometimes volatile states, worked in neighborhoods that could be dangerous. But Rachel's death made those abstract risks feel immediate and personal. If it could happen to Rachel, kind and experienced and careful, it could happen to any of them. The agency provided counseling and support, but many caregivers found themselves reconsidering their careers, questioning whether the risks were worth the rewards, whether they could continue doing this work while carrying the knowledge of what had happened to Rachel. Some left the profession, unable to overcome their fear. Others stayed but changed their practices, becoming more cautious, more vigilant, sometimes at the cost of the spontaneous connection and trust that had made them effective in their roles. As this documentary draws toward its conclusion, patterns become visible across these 5 cases, connecting them despite their differences in specifics. Each story involved moments where intervention was possible but did not occur, where warning signs existed but were not heeded, where systems designed to protect people failed in critical ways. And each story left behind survivors, families, and communities struggling to make sense of senseless violence, to find meaning in tragedy, to prevent future victims while honoring those who were lost. The first case, Lena Hartwell's abduction and murder, highlighted the role of technology in both documenting crime and raising questions about prevention. The security camera that captured her abduction was crucial to solving the case, but could not save her. It sparked debates about surveillance that continue to this day, about the balance between privacy and safety, about whether watching is enough or whether intervention is what truly matters. The second case, the murders of Robert and Susan Bell and the abduction of their children by Evan Cross, exposed systemic failures in parole supervision and interjurisdictional communication. Evan Cross should have been in prison long before he encountered the Bell family. His continued freedom was the result of bureaucratic failures, overwhelmed systems, and the lack of coordination between agencies. The case prompted reforms, but those reforms came too late for the Bells. The third case, Emily Rose's death at the hands of her boyfriend Caleb Turner, complicated simple narratives about perpetrators and victims. Caleb was a child when he killed Emily, acting out of fear and immaturity rather than malice. His prosecution as an adult and the sentence he received sparked debate about youth justice, about how society should respond when children commit terrible acts, about the purpose of punishment versus rehabilitation. The fourth case, Margaret Hale's murder by her son Lucas during a psychotic episode, challenged assumptions about criminal responsibility and mental illness. Lucas's commitment to a psychiatric facility rather than prison was controversial, but reflected a legal system attempting to distinguish between actions taken with full awareness and those driven by psychiatric conditions that distorted perception and judgment. The case raised difficult questions about how to balance justice for victims with appropriate treatment for mentally ill perpetrators. The fifth case, Rachel Moore's murder by Daniel Frost, a parolee who should have been under closer supervision, returned to themes of systemic failure and preventable tragedy. Rachel died because the parole system failed to adequately monitor someone with a history of violence, because warning signs were not recognized or acted upon, because the safety measures that should have protected her were inadequate. Together, these cases paint a picture of a society struggling to protect its members from violence, using systems that are often inadequate to the task. They highlight the limitations of reactive responses, of solving crimes after victims are already dead rather than preventing those crimes from occurring. They show the high cost of overwhelmed social services, under-resourced law enforcement, and bureaucratic failures that allow dangerous individuals to slip through gaps. But these cases also demonstrate resilience and positive change emerging from tragedy. Families who channeled grief into advocacy, pushing for legislative reforms and improved systems. Communities that rallied to support survivors and honor victims. Individuals who dedicated themselves to preventing future tragedies, learning from failures, and working to improve the institutions and practices that had proven insufficient. The reforms that emerged from these cases were varied and imperfect. Enhanced surveillance capabilities that solved some crimes while raising privacy concerns. Better databases and communication systems allowing law enforcement agencies to track offenders across jurisdictions. Improved training for recognizing mental health crises and intervening before they escalated into violence. Changes to parole systems, increasing supervision for high-risk individuals. Educational programs teaching young people about healthy relationships and available resources when facing crises. None of these reforms could undo the harm that had already occurred. Lena Hartwell, Robert and Susan Bell, Emily Rowe, Margaret Hale, and Rachel Moore remained dead, their potential and futures erased by violence. Their families continued to grieve, to struggle with absence and loss that would never fully heal. And the communities where these tragedies occurred carried scars, collective trauma that changed how people understood safety and vulnerability. But the reforms represented hope, however modest, that learning was occurring, that society was attempting to do better, to protect people more effectively, to prevent future victims. They acknowledged that while individual evil was sometimes impossible to predict or prevent entirely, systemic improvements could reduce opportunities for harm, could catch warning signs earlier, could intervene before violence became fatal. The role of technology continued to evolve as a central theme in crime prevention and investigation. The camera that captured Lena's abduction was relatively primitive by current standards, grainy and limited in its capabilities. Modern surveillance systems were far more sophisticated, incorporating facial recognition, behavior analysis algorithms, interconnected networks that tracked movement across vast areas. These technologies solved crimes that would have been unsolvable in earlier eras, identified suspects from minimal evidence, provided timelines and connections that human investigators would have struggled to establish. But technology also raised profound questions about the kind of society being created in the pursuit of safety. How much surveillance was acceptable? Who controlled the data being collected? How were algorithms making decisions about who was considered suspicious or dangerous? And perhaps most troubling, whether the focus on technological solutions distracted from addressing underlying social issues, the poverty and mental health crises, and social isolation that contributed to violence in the first place. The cases involving young people, Emily and Caleb's tragedy and Lucas Hale's psychotic break, highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of adolescence and young adulthood. The brain is still developing during these years. Impulse control and judgment not yet fully matured, emotions intense, and sometimes overwhelming. Young people face pressures that earlier generations did not. Social media amplifying insecurities, academic competition increasing stress, futures feeling increasingly uncertain. Supporting young people through this vulnerable period required more than just rules and punishments. It required genuine connection, adults who listened without judgment, resources available when crises emerged, systems that recognized when someone was struggling before that struggle led to tragedy. Schools, families, and communities all had roles to play, creating environments where young people felt safe asking for help. where mental health was treated with the same seriousness as physical health, where mistakes were opportunities for growth rather than occasions for condemnation. The cases involving severe mental illness, particularly Lucas Hale's murder of his mother, raised questions that extended far beyond individual tragedy. How many people were suffering from conditions like schizophrenia without receiving adequate treatment? How many families were struggling to support loved ones while navigating underfunded mental health systems? How many future tragedies could be prevented if society invested more resources in early identification and treatment of serious psychiatric conditions? The stigma surrounding mental illness contributed to the problem, making people reluctant to seek help, families ashamed to acknowledge struggles, systems treating psychiatric conditions as less legitimate than physical ailments. Changing this stigma required cultural shifts, normalizing conversations about mental health, ensuring that treatment was accessible and affordable, training professionals to recognize warning signs, creating legal frameworks that allowed for intervention while respecting rights and dignity. The systemic failures highlighted in Evan Cross's case and Daniel Frost's parole violations pointed to deeper issues in how society managed individuals who had demonstrated violent tendencies. The parole system was designed with rehabilitation as a goal, with the belief that people could change and deserved opportunities to reintegrate into society. But the system was also under-resourced, officers carrying impossible caseloads, supervision often minimal and ineffective, violations not addressed promptly or adequately. Improving these systems required resources that were often scarce, political will that was frequently lacking, and difficult conversations about balancing rehabilitation with public safety. Some offenders genuinely reformed and posed no ongoing risk. Others, like Evan Cross and Daniel Frost, remained dangerous and should not have been released or should have been supervised much more intensively. Distinguishing between these categories, making accurate risk assessments, providing appropriate levels of supervision, all of these required more investment and better practices than currently existed in many jurisdictions. The communities affected by these crimes each responded in their own ways, shaped by local cultures and specific circumstances. Brookhaven Shores became more security conscious, more protective of children, sometimes to an extent that felt stifling to young people who wanted independence. Redstone Valley grappled with questions about teenage relationships and the pressures young people faced, implementing programs, but also struggling with how to talk about tragedy without traumatizing students. Clearwater Ridge was divided over mental health and criminal responsibility, some people becoming more compassionate and others more fearful. Northbridge City examined its parole system and caregiver safety, making changes while knowing they came too late for Rachel. These different responses reflected the complexity of trying to learn from tragedy, the difficulty of translating grief and anger into constructive change. There was no single lesson, no universal solution that could prevent all future violence. Each case was unique in important ways, and the responses needed to be tailored to specific circumstances and risks. But common threads did exist across all these cases. The importance of listening when someone expressed concerns, of taking seriously behaviors that seemed unusual or troubling even when they did not rise to the level of obvious danger. The need for better communication and coordination between systems, ensuring that warning signs in one context were visible to others who might need to intervene. The value of early intervention, addressing problems when they were still manageable rather than waiting until crisis occurred. And the understanding that preventing violence required sustained investment in social supports, mental health services, education, and community building, not just reactive law enforcement after harm had already occurred. The families of victims in these cases became reluctant advocates, speaking about their losses not to relive trauma, but to prevent others from experiencing similar pain. Lena's mother pushed for child safety legislation and surveillance expansion. The Bell children's relatives supported reforms to parole systems and interjurisdictional communication. Emily's parents worked with schools to implement relationship education programs. Margaret Hale's colleagues advocated for mental health awareness and early intervention. Rachel's family funded scholarships and pushed for caregiver safety protocols. These advocacy efforts represented a way to create meaning from meaningless violence, to ensure that victims were remembered for more than how they died, to turn personal tragedy into broader benefit. But the emotional cost of such advocacy was high. Family members had to repeatedly share their stories, relive their worst moments, expose their grief to public scrutiny. They had to work within systems that moved slowly, that resisted change, that sometimes seemed more interested in protecting institutional interests than in preventing future victims. The perpetrators in these cases, those who survived and were incarcerated, faced their own reckonings. Marcus Vance, who killed Lena Hartwell, spent his life in prison with the knowledge that he was universally despised, that his name would be remembered only for evil. Evan Cross died in custody before his full sentence could be served, his death met with little sympathy. Caleb Turner, still young, faced decades in juvenile detention and possible adult prison time, trying to understand how a moment of fear and anger had destroyed 2 lives. Lucas Hale remained in psychiatric treatment, stabilized on medication, but carrying the unbearable knowledge that he had killed his mother. Daniel Frost served life without parole, his lack of remorse ensuring that he would never receive any consideration for release. These different fates reflected different understandings of justice, different beliefs about responsibility and punishment, and the possibility of redemption. Society struggled to articulate consistent principles for responding to violence, particularly when cases involved mental illness, youth, or other complicating factors. The result was inconsistency and ongoing debate, with reasonable people disagreeing about appropriate responses. For survivors of these crimes, those who witnessed violence or lost loved ones, the journey toward healing was long and nonlinear. Mara and Jonah Bell worked with therapists specializing in trauma, slowly rebuilding a sense of safety and trust that had been shattered. Lena's parents found some measure of peace in their advocacy work, though the grief never fully subsided. Emily's family struggled with complicated feelings about Caleb, anger mixed with sadness that 2 young lives had been destroyed. Margaret's colleagues honored her memory while grappling with the reality that her son had killed her. Rachel's clients and fellow caregivers adjusted to her absence while trying to maintain the compassion and dedication she had exemplified. Trauma specialists who worked with survivors emphasized that healing did not mean forgetting or moving on in any simple sense. It meant learning to carry loss without being destroyed by it, to integrate tragedy into life stories without allowing it to define everything, to find ways forward even when the past could not be changed. Some survivors found healing through connection with others who had experienced similar losses, through support groups and shared advocacy. Others healed through solitude and private remembrance, through creating personal rituals and memorials. There was no single correct path, only the ongoing effort to survive and eventually to find moments of peace and purpose. The media coverage of these cases varied in quality and impact. At its best, journalism served the public interest by investigating systemic failures, holding institutions accountable, giving voice to victims and their families, educating the public about prevention. At its worst, it sensationalized tragedy, exploited grief for ratings, reduced complex human stories to simplistic narratives about good and evil, and moved on to the next story before meaningful understanding or change could occur. Responsible coverage of violence required careful balance, providing enough detail to inform without gratuitously describing suffering, respecting the privacy and dignity of victims while holding perpetrators and failing systems accountable, maintaining focus on prevention and reform rather than just the spectacle of tragedy. Some journalists achieved this balance, producing coverage that genuinely served the public interest. Others failed, prioritizing sensation over substance, contributing to a culture of fear without providing meaningful context or solutions. The true crime genre itself, of which this documentary is a part, raised ethical questions about the consumption of violence as entertainment. There was value in examining these cases, in understanding how violence occurred and how it might be prevented. But there was also risk of exploitation, of turning real suffering into content for passive consumption, of desensitizing audiences to the reality of crime through overexposure to details. This documentary has attempted to navigate these ethical challenges by focusing on systemic issues and prevention, by treating victims with respect and dignity, by avoiding gratuitous details of violence, by emphasizing the human cost of crime and the ongoing impact on survivors. The goal has been education and understanding rather than sensation, honoring victims by ensuring their stories contribute to prevention rather than simply providing disturbing details for entertainment. As we approach the conclusion of this documentary, it is worth reflecting on what these 5 cases collectively reveal about safety, justice, and prevention in modern society. They show that violence is rarely random or unpredictable, that warning signs usually exist even if they are missed or ignored, that systems fail more often than they should, and that the cost of those failures is measured in human lives and generational trauma. But these cases also show human resilience, the capacity to survive unimaginable harm and to find ways forward, to create meaning from tragedy, to advocate for change even while carrying profound grief. They show communities coming together, supporting each other through collective trauma, refusing to let violence define them even as they were changed by it. They show incremental progress toward better systems, more awareness, improved responses, even as they acknowledge how much work remains to be done. The tension between hope and despair is present in all these stories. Despair at the violence that occurred, at the lives lost and the suffering inflicted, at the failures that allowed harm to happen. Hope in the resilience of survivors, in the dedication of those working to improve systems, in the possibility that learning from tragedy might prevent future victims. This documentary does not offer simple solutions because simple solutions do not exist for problems as complex and multifaceted as violence prevention. But it does offer direction, principles that might guide efforts toward greater safety, even as we acknowledge that perfect safety is impossible and that attempts to achieve it might create other harms. The first principle is the importance of seeing and listening. So many of the failures in these cases involved warning signs that existed but were not recognized or acted upon. People who expressed concerns that were dismissed. Behaviors that seemed unusual but were explained away. Systems that collected information but did not share it effectively or act on it promptly. Creating cultures where concerns are taken seriously, where people feel empowered to speak up, where information is shared appropriately across relevant parties. These changes could prevent some tragedies. The second principle is early intervention. Violence often escalates over time, beginning with smaller offenses or warning signs that gradually worsen. Intervening early, when problems are more manageable and less harm has occurred, is far more effective than waiting until crisis. This requires resources invested in prevention rather than just reaction, mental health services and social supports that address underlying issues, systems that identify risks and respond appropriately before violence occurs. The third principle is adequate resources for systems we rely on. Parole officers cannot supervise effectively when they have caseloads of hundreds. Teachers cannot identify struggling students when classrooms are overcrowded. Mental health professionals cannot provide adequate treatment when services are underfunded and wait lists are months long. Law enforcement cannot investigate thoroughly when departments are understaffed. Expecting these systems to function while withholding necessary resources is both unrealistic and unjust. The fourth principle is coordination and communication. Violence often involves multiple systems, jurisdictions, agencies, each with relevant information but none seeing the complete picture. Breaking down silos, creating mechanisms for appropriate information sharing, ensuring that warning signs in one context are visible to others who might need to intervene. These changes could help identify patterns and risks that individual systems miss. The fifth principle is acknowledging complexity. Violence is rarely the result of a single cause or simple evil. It emerges from interactions between individual factors, social conditions, system failures, chance circumstances. Understanding this complexity does not excuse violence or minimize victim suffering, but it does suggest that effective prevention requires multifaceted responses that address various contributing factors rather than looking for single solutions. The sixth principle is the centrality of human connection. Across these cases, isolation and disconnection played roles in enabling violence. Perpetrators who felt alienated from society. Victims who had no one to turn to when they felt unsafe. Young people who could not talk to adults about struggles they were experiencing. Communities where neighbors did not know each other well enough to recognize when something was wrong. Strengthening human connections. Building communities where people look out for each other. Creating relationships where vulnerable individuals feel supported. These social investments have crime prevention value that is sometimes overlooked in favor of technological or enforcement solutions. The seventh principle is the importance of learning from failures. Every tragedy offers lessons if we are willing to examine what went wrong honestly and to make changes based on that examination. This requires overcoming institutional defensiveness, admitting when systems failed, taking responsibility for preventing similar failures in the future. It also requires sustained attention, following through on reforms rather than allowing them to be forgotten as media attention moves on to other stories. These principles are not revolutionary. They are mostly common sense, ideas that people working in relevant fields have been advocating for years. But implementing them consistently, providing resources they require, overcoming political and institutional obstacles to change, these challenges have proven difficult across jurisdictions and contexts. Progress happens slowly when it happens at all, often only after tragedies that might have been prevented. The 5 cases examined in this documentary occurred over a span of years, in different locations, involving different people and circumstances. But they share enough commonality to suggest patterns, to indicate that these are not isolated incidents, but manifestations of broader issues that affect communities across the country. Child abductions by predators who operate in familiar spaces. Serial offenders who exploit system failures to continue victimizing people. Young people who make terrible decisions with irreversible consequences. Severe mental illness leading to violence when treatment is inadequate. Parolees who remain dangerous because supervision is insufficient. These types of cases repeat themselves with disturbing regularity, the specific details changing, but the underlying dynamics remaining consistent. Acknowledging these patterns is both discouraging and potentially constructive. Discouraging because it reveals how frequently these preventable tragedies occur, how many victims there are, how much suffering results from system failures and missed opportunities. But potentially constructive because patterns can be studied and understood, risks can be identified and mitigated, interventions can be designed based on what works in similar cases. The research literature on violence prevention has grown substantially in recent decades, informed by cases like those examined here. Scholars have identified risk factors, protective factors, evidence-based interventions that show promise. Some of this knowledge has been translated into practice, programs and policies that reflect current understanding. But translation is incomplete and inconsistent, with some communities implementing effective practices while others lag behind, with funding often inadequate to sustain even promising initiatives. There is also tension between different approaches to violence prevention. Some emphasize individual responsibility, arguing that perpetrators make choices and should be held accountable regardless of background or circumstances. Others emphasize social conditions, arguing that violence emerges from poverty, trauma, inequality, inadequate support systems, and that prevention requires addressing these root causes. Still others focus on technological solutions, surveillance and data analysis, and predictive algorithms designed to identify risks before violence occurs. The reality is likely that all these approaches have value and limitations, that effective prevention requires using multiple strategies simultaneously, that no single approach can address all the factors contributing to violence. But finding the right balance, allocating resources effectively across different strategies, overcoming ideological divisions to implement pragmatic solutions, these challenges persist. The victims in these cases, Lena Hartwell, Robert and Susan Bell, Emily Rowe, Margaret Hale, and Rachel Moore, were real people with lives that mattered beyond the manner of their deaths. They had families who loved them, friends who valued them, communities where they contributed and were valued. They had routines and preferences, dreams and plans, all cut short by violence they did not deserve and could not have fully prevented themselves. Remembering them as whole people rather than just as victims is important. Lena was a child learning to be independent, trusted by her parents to handle a simple errand, excited about growing up. Robert and Susan Bell were parents working to provide stability for their children, ordinary people living an unremarkable life that was good and sufficient and tragically interrupted. Emily Rowe was a teenager navigating the complexities of adolescence, trying to figure out relationships and identity while managing fears about an unwanted pregnancy. Margaret Hale was a dedicated teacher who loved literature and her students, a mother who had worked hard to raise her son well. Rachel Moore was a caregiver who treated vulnerable clients with dignity and compassion, making their lives measurably better through her presence. These brief descriptions cannot capture the fullness of who these people were, the depth of the loss experienced by those who loved them. But they serve as reminders that behind every statistic, every news story, every case study, there are individuals whose absence creates holes that never completely close, whose potential was never realized, whose value to their communities was cut short. The perpetrators in these cases are remembered differently, their actions defining them in ways that erase most other aspects of their identities. Marcus Vance, Evan Cross, Caleb Turner, Lucas Hale, Daniel Frost, their names are now associated primarily with violence, with harm inflicted, with lives destroyed. Whether they deserve any sympathy or understanding alongside condemnation is a question that different people answer differently, shaped by values and experiences and beliefs about human nature. What is clear is that understanding why violence occurred, what factors contributed to these individuals committing terrible acts, is different from excusing those acts. Understanding can inform prevention without minimizing harm or disrespecting victims. It can help identify warning signs, improve risk assessment, design more effective interventions. But understanding must be balanced with accountability, with recognition that regardless of contributing factors, the perpetrators made choices that caused profound harm and that society has legitimate interests in both punishment and prevention. The loved ones of victims often struggle with how to respond to perpetrators, particularly in cases involving youth or mental illness. Some find that forgiveness or understanding helps with their own healing, allows them to move forward without being consumed by anger. Others feel that any sympathy for perpetrators betrays victims, that the focus should be entirely on those who were harmed rather than those who caused harm. There is no right answer, only individual journeys toward whatever peace is possible. The communities affected by these crimes continue to live with their legacies. Memorials stand in public places, reminding residents of what was lost and what was learned. Organizations formed in victims' names continue work aimed at prevention. Policies and practices changed in response to these tragedies remain in place, though sometimes eroding as time passes and attention shifts. And the people who were present, who lived through these events, carry memories that shape how they understand safety, trust, and vulnerability. If you're finding this story compelling and want to see more content like this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these important stories. For younger people growing up in these communities, the cases become part of local history, stories told to illustrate dangers and the importance of caution. But there is a risk that such stories, while cautionary, also instill fear disproportionate to actual risk, that they teach young people to see the world as fundamentally dangerous rather than helping them develop reasonable awareness and judgment. Balancing age-appropriate safety education with maintaining the freedom and innocence of childhood is an ongoing challenge for parents and educators in affected communities. The passage of time changes how these cases are understood and discussed. Immediately after violence occurs, emotions run high, attention is intense, demands for action are urgent. As years pass, intensity fades, details are forgotten by those not directly affected, the cases become historical rather than immediate. This is natural and perhaps necessary, allowing communities to heal and move forward. But it also creates challenges for sustained reform, for maintaining political will to invest in prevention, for ensuring that lessons learned are not forgotten as those who remember retire or move on. Anniversary coverage in local media serves to remind communities, bringing renewed attention on significant dates. The 5th anniversary of Lena's death, the 10th anniversary of the Bell murders. These markers prompt retrospective articles examining what has changed and what remains the same. Such coverage can be valuable if it focuses on progress and remaining challenges rather than simply retelling tragic details. But it can also re-traumatize survivors and family members, forcing them to relive pain on dates that are already difficult. The intersection of these cases with broader social issues is worth noting. Lena's case occurred at a time of rapid expansion in surveillance technology, feeding into debates about privacy and security that continue today. The Bell case coincided with growing recognition of flaws in parole systems, contributing to reform efforts that had mixed success. Emily and Caleb's case unfolded amid increasing awareness of teen mental health challenges and relationship pressures. Lucas Hale's case occurred as mental health was becoming less stigmatized, but services remained inadequate. Rachel's case highlighted ongoing issues with parole supervision and caregiver safety in an aging society. Understanding these cases within their broader contexts helps identify opportunities for systemic change beyond individual incidents. Lena's death was tragic, but it was also part of a pattern of child abductions that suggested need for coordinated responses to predatory behavior. The Bell murders were horrific, but they revealed parole system failures affecting numerous cases beyond theirs. Emily's death raised questions about teen development and relationship education that extended far beyond Redstone Valley. Margaret's murder prompted discussions about mental health care access relevant to countless families. Rachel's killing exposed vulnerabilities affecting caregivers nationwide. The challenge is translating this broader understanding into effective action. It is easier to focus on individual cases, to see violence as isolated incidents caused by uniquely evil or damaged individuals, than to grapple with systemic issues requiring sustained effort and resources to address. But viewing cases in isolation limits what can be learned and what preventive measures might be effective. Policymakers face the difficult task of balancing competing interests and values when responding to violent crime. There are legitimate demands for punishment and incapacitation, for ensuring that those who cause harm face consequences and cannot victimize others. There are also arguments for rehabilitation and redemption, for believing that people can change and deserve opportunities to do so. There are concerns about civil liberties and privacy, about not creating a surveillance state in pursuit of security. And there are practical constraints of limited resources, requiring choices about priorities and what can realistically be accomplished. These competing considerations explain why responses to violence are often inconsistent and incomplete, why reforms satisfy no one completely, why progress is slower than victims and their advocates would prefer. There are no easy answers when fundamental values conflict, when resources are constrained, when uncertainty exists about what interventions will be effective. But the difficulty of these challenges does not excuse inaction or acceptance of preventable harm. Looking across these 5 cases, certain questions recur. Could these crimes have been prevented? In most cases, yes, if various factors had been different. Better surveillance might have deterred Marcus Vance or helped identify him sooner. More effective parole supervision would have contained Evan Cross. Earlier mental health intervention might have helped Caleb manage his fear differently or identified Lucas's illness before it became dangerous. Adequate parole oversight would have kept Daniel Frost from having the opportunity to target Rachel. But saying these crimes could have been prevented is different from saying they should have been prevented in any simple sense. Prevention would have required specific actions by specific people at specific times, often without clear evidence that risk was imminent. It would have required resources that did not exist, systems functioning better than they typically do, individuals making different judgment calls than the ones they made. It is easy in hindsight to identify failures, much harder in real time to know which concerns to prioritize, which risks to take most seriously, how to allocate limited resources among countless competing demands. This is not to excuse failures or to suggest that nothing could have been done. It is to acknowledge complexity, to recognize that prevention is difficult and uncertain, that perfect safety is impossible, that efforts to prevent all harm might create other problems, including restrictions on freedom and erosion of privacy. Finding appropriate balances, implementing improvements that provide meaningful benefit without excessive cost. These are ongoing challenges without final solutions. The role of chance and circumstance in these cases is also worth noting. Small differences in timing or location might have resulted in different outcomes. If Lena had left the store 5 minutes earlier or later, she might not have encountered Marcus Vance. If a neighbor had been outside when Evan Cross broke into the Bell home, police might have been called sooner. If Emily and Caleb had had their argument somewhere more public, witnesses might have intervened. If Lucas's psychotic break had occurred when his mother was not home, she might have survived. If Rachel had taken a different route or arrived at Dorothy's building at a different time, she might not have crossed paths with Daniel Frost. These contingencies do not change responsibility or suggest that violence was simply bad luck, but they do complicate simple narratives about inevitability, about whether different choices or systems would have definitely prevented harm. They suggest humility about our ability to prevent all violence, acknowledgement that some harm occurs despite reasonable precautions, that we cannot eliminate risk entirely no matter how much we invest in prevention. This recognition does not counsel fatalism or acceptance of preventable harm. Most of these cases involve failures more substantial than mere bad luck, missed opportunities that could and should have been seized, warning signs that should have prompted intervention. But it does suggest that after reasonable efforts at prevention, after implementing evidence-based practices and maintaining vigilant systems, some residual risk remains. Learning to live with that risk while taking appropriate precautions is part of functioning in an imperfect world. The question of how much to invest in prevention relative to other social goods is fundamentally political, reflecting values about collective responsibility, individual liberty, the proper role of government, and the allocation of limited resources. Some argue that preventing violence should be the highest priority, that no cost is too great to save lives. Others argue that excessive focus on security diminishes quality of life, that attempts to eliminate all risk create surveillance states and limit freedom, that resources spent on security might do more good addressing other social needs. These debates are not likely to be resolved conclusively, representing ongoing tensions between security and liberty, between collective and individual interests, between different visions of good society. But the debates are important, shaping policies that affect how safe people feel and actually are, how much freedom they enjoy, what kind of communities they live in. The 5 cases examined in this documentary contribute to these broader conversations, providing concrete examples of what happens when prevention fails, of the real human costs of systemic inadequacies, of the ways violence ripples outward affecting families and communities. They serve as reminders that these are not abstract policy debates, but issues affecting real people, that the stakes are measured in lives and trauma and shattered futures. As this documentary approaches its conclusion, it is worth reflecting on what has been learned and what questions remain. These cases revealed patterns in how violence occurs, how systems fail, how communities respond, how survivors heal. They highlighted the importance of early warning signs, coordinated responses, adequate resources, human connection, and sustained effort at reform. They demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of technology, law enforcement, judicial systems, and social services. But they also revealed how much remains unknown or uncertain. What interventions are most effective at preventing violence? How can limited resources be allocated to achieve maximum benefit? How can we balance security with liberty, accountability with mercy, punishment with rehabilitation? How do we create communities where people are both safe and free, protected without being controlled, vigilant without being paranoid? These questions have been debated for generations and will continue to be debated, informed by cases like these, but never fully resolved. Progress comes incrementally, through trial and error, through learning from failures and building on successes. It requires patience and persistence, willingness to admit mistakes, and to keep trying despite setbacks, commitment to improvement even when perfect solutions remain elusive. The victims of violence examined in this documentary deserved better. They deserved systems that functioned properly, communities that protected them, chances to live full lives. Their deaths were preventable in meaningful senses, resulting from failures that should not have occurred. Honoring them requires acknowledging those failures, learning from them, working to prevent future victims from suffering similar fates. But honoring victims also requires remembering them as more than cautionary tales, more than examples of what can go wrong. Lena, Robert, and Susan, Emily, Margaret, and Rachel were people who lived and loved and contributed to their communities. Their value was not created by their deaths, and their legacy should include the good they did while alive, not just the tragedy of how they died. The survivors of these crimes, family members, and loved ones who continue living with loss, have shown remarkable strength in channeling grief toward positive purposes. The advocacy work they have undertaken, the organizations they have founded, the changes they have fought for, these represent victories of sorts, meanings created from meaninglessness, good emerging from evil. Their work ensures that victims are remembered not just on anniversaries, but through ongoing efforts that make communities safer and provide support to others facing similar tragedies. For Mara and Jonah Bell, now adults building lives in the shadow of childhood trauma. The journey continues. They have become advocates for victims' rights, speaking about their experience when they feel able, supporting reforms to systems that failed their family. Their resilience is inspiring but also hard-won, the product of years of therapy and support, of determination to not let what happened to them define their entire lives. They honor their parents by living well, by refusing to be destroyed by the violence they survived, by working to prevent other families from experiencing similar loss. Caleb Turner, now in his mid-20s, remains incarcerated but by all accounts has engaged seriously with rehabilitation programs. He has expressed remorse for Emily's death, taking responsibility in ways he could not as a frightened 14-year-old. He has worked with his therapist to understand the fear and immaturity that led to that terrible moment on the riverbank, to develop the emotional skills he lacked when Emily died. Whether he will ever be released, whether he can eventually contribute positively to society, remains to be seen. But his case continues to prompt discussions about youth justice, about how to respond when children commit terrible acts, about the possibility of redemption and growth even after causing profound harm. Lucas Hale's situation is more ambiguous. His schizophrenia is well controlled with medication, and he is no longer experiencing the psychotic symptoms that led to his mother's death. But he carries the knowledge that he killed the person who loved him most, a burden that no medication can eliminate. He participates in his treatment, works with his therapeutic team, but faces an uncertain future in indefinite psychiatric commitment. His case remains contentious, some people believing he should be in prison regardless of mental illness, others feeling that his commitment to treatment represents an appropriate response to violence driven by psychiatric crisis. The perpetrators who showed little remorse, Marcus Vance and Daniel Frost particularly, serve as reminders that not everyone can be rehabilitated, that some people remain dangerous regardless of intervention. Their cases support arguments for incapacitation as a legitimate purpose of criminal justice, for ensuring that those who pose ongoing threats cannot harm others. But they also raise questions about what to do with people who will spend their entire lives in prison, how to manage aging prison populations, whether life sentences serve legitimate purposes or simply warehouse people at great expense. The communities where these crimes occurred have moved forward in various ways, changed by tragedy but not destroyed by it. Brookhaven Shores remains a coastal town where families raise children, though with more caution than before Lena's death. The region where the Bell murders occurred has implemented better coordination between law enforcement agencies, though resource constraints continue to limit what can be accomplished. Redstone Valley schools continue providing relationship education and mental health support to teenagers navigating adolescence. Clearwater Ridge debates mental health policy with greater awareness of the stakes involved. Northbridge City has strengthened parole supervision and caregiver safety protocols, though gaps remain. These communities demonstrate both resilience and the lasting impact of violence. Life continues, new families move in, children who were not yet born when these crimes occurred grow up hearing about them as local history. But the scars remain visible to those who were present, shaping how they understand their communities and what they teach their children about safety and trust. The broader lessons from these cases extend beyond specific communities affected. They speak to anyone living in society, anyone interested in preventing violence, anyone trying to understand how terrible things happen and whether they can be prevented. They highlight the importance of systems functioning properly, of people being vigilant without being paranoid, of communities supporting vulnerable members, of resources being adequate to the challenges faced. But perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest and hardest to implement consistently: paying attention. So many failures in these cases involve people or systems not paying adequate attention to warning signs, to concerning behaviors, to information suggesting risk. Paying attention requires time and resources that are often scarce. It requires overcoming the natural tendency to assume that everything will be fine, that bad things happen elsewhere to other people. It requires sustained vigilance without allowing that vigilance to become consuming fear. This documentary has attempted to examine 5 tragic cases with honesty and respect to understand what happened and why without exploiting victims or sensationalizing violence. It has sought to identify lessons that might prevent future tragedies while acknowledging the complexity of violence prevention and the limitations of any single approach. It has tried to honor victims by remembering them as whole people while using their stories to advance understanding and improve systems. The cases of Lena Hartwell, Robert and Susan Bell, Emily Rowe, Margaret Hale, and Rachel Moore represent only a small fraction of the violence that occurs daily across the country and around the world. Thousands of other victims have their own stories, their own families grieving, their own communities affected. The scale of violence can feel overwhelming, leading to despair about whether anything can be done or to numbness that protects against constant awareness of suffering. But despair and numbness are not inevitable responses. The alternative is engagement, informed by cases like these, but focused on prevention and improvement. It means supporting policies and programs that evidence suggests reduce violence. It means contributing to communities in ways that strengthen social bonds and reduce isolation. It means paying attention to people who seem to be struggling and offering help when appropriate. It means speaking up when something seems wrong rather than assuming someone else will intervene. It means demanding accountability from institutions and systems that fail in their protective responsibilities. These actions will not eliminate violence or prevent all tragedies. Some harm will occur regardless of prevention efforts, reflecting the reality that we cannot control everything and that some people will cause harm despite interventions. But meaningful reduction in violence is possible, achievable through sustained effort and appropriate investment, and the lives saved through such efforts represent invaluable victories, even if they are invisible, preventions that leave no victims to count or stories to tell. The tension between hope and realism threads through this entire documentary. Realism about the prevalence of violence, about system inadequacies, about the difficulty of prevention, but also hope in human resilience, in capacity for change, in incremental progress towards safer communities, in the possibility that learning from tragedy can prevent future victims. This balance between hope and realism is necessary for sustained engagement with difficult issues. Pure optimism is naive, suggesting that simple solutions exist and that violence can be easily eliminated. Pure pessimism is paralyzing, suggesting that nothing can be done and that effort is wasted. The middle ground acknowledges both the difficulty of the challenges and the importance of continuing to work toward improvement despite obstacles and setbacks. The families of the victims in these cases embody this balance. They live with permanent loss, with grief that will never completely heal, with knowledge that their loved ones died preventably. But they also work toward preventing other families from experiencing similar loss, toward improving systems that failed them, toward creating meaning from tragedy. Their work is difficult and painful, requiring them to revisit trauma repeatedly. But it also provides purpose and honors those who were lost. For viewers of this documentary, the question is what to do with the information and understanding gained from these cases. Simply consuming true crime content without reflection or action provides entertainment, but little else. The value comes from genuine engagement with the issues raised, from thinking critically about violence prevention, from supporting reforms and practices that might reduce harm. This might mean advocating for specific policy changes, supporting organizations working on violence prevention, participating in community programs that strengthen social bonds, having difficult conversations with young people about relationships and mental health, or simply being more attentive to signs that someone might be struggling or at risk. The specific actions will vary based on individual circumstances and capabilities, but the principle remains consistent. Using knowledge to drive positive change rather than just passive consumption. As we reach the final moments of this documentary, the faces and stories of 5 individuals remain central. Lena Hartwell, 11 years old, walking home with groceries, trusting that her familiar neighborhood was safe. Robert and Susan Bell, ordinary parents living ordinary lives, unable to protect themselves or their children from violence that entered their home. Emily Rowe, 15 years old, navigating teenage relationships and fears, dying on a riverbank in a moment of fear and poor judgment. Margaret Hale, 50 years old, dedicated teacher and mother, killed by her own son during a psychotic episode. Rachel Moore, 57 years old, caregiver who treated vulnerable people with dignity, murdered by someone who should have been more closely supervised. These 5 people, among thousands of other victims, deserve to be remembered. Their deaths were tragedies that should not have occurred, failures of individuals and systems that should have protected them. Their stories have been told here not to exploit their suffering, but to honor their memories by advancing understanding and working toward prevention. The subtitle of this documentary might be When Safety Fails. The cases examined show how assumptions about safety can be wrong, how systems designed to protect sometimes fail catastrophically, how violence can emerge from unexpected sources. But the documentary is also about how communities respond to failure, how survivors rebuild, how lessons can be learned even from the worst tragedies. Justice remembers these victims through the legal proceedings that held perpetrators accountable, through the sentences that ensured some would never harm anyone else, through the verdicts that provided some measure of closure even if they could not provide healing. But prevention saves lives that justice can only avenge after the fact. The real honor to victims comes through preventing future victims, through building systems that work better, through creating communities where people are safer. As we close, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned from these stories. If this documentary has been meaningful to you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own experiences. These conversations matter, and your engagement helps ensure these important stories reach others who need to hear them. The work of prevention continues, informed by cases like these, but focused on the future. The victims whose stories have been told here cannot be brought back. The harm done to survivors and families cannot be undone. But their legacies can include fewer future victims, better systems, stronger communities, greater awareness. That is the modest but meaningful hope that emerges from tragedy. The possibility that suffering might lead to learning, that loss might motivate improvement, that remembering the past might help create a safer future. Justice remembers, but prevention saves. Both are necessary, both honor victims in different ways, both require sustained commitment and effort. The 5 cases examined in this documentary represent failures of prevention, tragedies that occurred despite opportunities to intervene. Learning from those failures, implementing the lessons they teach, working toward a future with fewer such tragedies. That is how we honor those who were lost and protect those who remain. Thank you for watching, for engaging with these difficult stories, for caring enough to invest time in understanding violence and prevention. Stay safe, look out for each other, pay attention to warning signs, support systems that protect the vulnerable, and remember that every individual action toward creating safer communities matters. Together, through sustained effort and genuine commitment to prevention, we can reduce the violence that creates victims and destroys families. That is the hope, however modest, that emerges from even the darkest tragedies.